Chapter 9. Jimmy Jarrett arrives. Followed by EARL edition and the Great Depression. We have come full circle from the start of this story, and we have been made aware of the people and events that has brought us to this point in time. We are once again reminded of that little if word, and can realize more fully the importance of it in our lives, and how we became who we are. It's an amazing thing, and one that I will never fully understand, but it seems as though everything happens by chance. Bob started to school the 1st of September. Aunt Lou took him the first day, because Mom was recuperating from delivering me a few days before. In the following year of 1931, we moved 1 block south, and 1 block west, on the southeast corner of 7th and Main. Since then a house has been built to the west of it, making it the corner house. The house was known as the Old Doctor's Place, and is still standing to this day. Aunt Lou and Uncle Earl lived 1 block east of us, on the southwest corner of 6th and Main. It was a 2-story house, and had shiny polished hardwood floors, and as a child it seemed like a mansion to me. The Methodist church was across the street, on the southeast corner. Across the alley to the south of their place was a small cement building, that housed the city fire truck. When I was a little boy, I remember peeking into the window, and viewing the big red monster in awe. I must have been a pretty active baby. Mom said that when I was 9 months old, I bounced the springs out of my bed. In 1931, Bud started his first grade of school, and Bob was in the 2nd grade. Dad was commuting to work at the foundry, in his Whippet. Grandma and Grandpa Jarrett were still living at 1810 South 24th Street. Grandpa was a foreman, with the St. Joseph Railway, Light, Heat, and Power Company. I don't know how they managed to do it, but Uncle Lloyd, Uncle Mike, and Aunt Ruby were living with Grandma and Grandpa, on South 24th. The house is still standing, and it's a small one to house that many people, but I guess you have to make do with what's available. Bob told me he remembers going to visit our grandparents at that location. He said a motorcycle that belonged to Uncle Mike, or Uncle Lloyd, was parked in the alley, and he and Bud somehow got it rolling, and it ran into the side of the house. In 1932, I was already running off down the alley in Savannah, to see Aunt Lou. She told me many years later, that I would come to her screen door, and put my greasy hands on it, and holler Lou, until she came to the door. She said she never did wash the screen, because she wanted 42 to leave my fingerprints on it. On Thursday, February 11, 1932, smoke billowed from the roof of the 30-year-old school. Decades later, Bob told how the kids were marched outside. He said that he wasn't aware it was on fire, until they were outside the building, and he could see the smoke rising up into the winter sky. People came from near and far, and there were many anxious parents that expected the worst when they saw the smoke, and the news of the fire traveled as rapidly as the fire had. Mom was home taking care of me. I was 17 months old at the time. Aunt Lou rushed to the school for her, where she found both Bob and Bud unharmed. The fact there were no deaths or injuries was great news for all of Northwest Missouri. The building was so badly damaged that it had to be razed. For the remainder of the school year, classes were held in churches, lodge halls, the courthouse, and other buildings. Bonds for a new school were levied for $50,000, and the cornerstone was laid on Saturday, July 2nd. The new school was completed, and an open house was held after the Thanksgiving vacation, on Monday, November 28, 1932. After the fire occurred, they began to clean up what remained of the building, and selling the lumber for salvage. Dad decided to buy some of the lumber, and purchase a lot in a new addition of an area being opened up for development, just outside the St. Joe city limits. RAMBLLN was a 155-acre estate with a large castle-like mansion, situated on a hill overlooking the valley below. A quarter-mile lane lined with beautiful old maple trees ran from Lake Boulevard up to the castle. According to my research, the castle was built by a wealthy druggist, John DeMond, in the early 1870s. It was then acquired by James N. Burns, an early pioneer banker in St. Joseph. James Nelson Burns, August 22, 1827, 1/24/1889, Daniel D. Burns, January 4, 1851, November 2, 1899. Calvin F. Burns, 17-1856, November 20, 1893. James N. was probably the father of Daniel D. and Calvin F. In 1883, Calvin F. was listed as president of the National Bank, James N. as capitalist, with his office in the First National Bank, and Daniel D. was an attorney with Green and Burns, with his office at 105 North 3rd Street. James N. Burns was apparently the old patriarch of the family. I found no record that he had ever lived in EARL, however his widow showed her address at EARL, from 1891 until her death in 1901. She was probably living out her final years there, with another son, James N. Jr. James N. Sr. listed his address as the foot of 11th Street. There is a big old mansion at the foot of 11th Street, where Lake Boulevard joins it. Could this be his former home? It sat quite a ways off the road, and was shaded by a large grove of trees. It was a real spooky looking place, and I used to ride my bicycle up the lane almost to the house, then I would get scared and come roaring down the hill to safety. I never did see anyone there, but I'm sure it was occupied. EARL was bounded to the north by East Lake Boulevard, to the south by the Southwest Parkway, to the west by Terrace Avenue, and to the east by South 11th Street Road. The front entrance was at Lake Boulevard, and the back entrance at Terrace Avenue. A story was often told when I was a young boy, that Mr. Burns had a young son, and that he lost his life when he stepped into quicksand along the creek that ran through the eastern part of the estate. It was said that he had a bronze monument erected along the creek bank, and that it stood there for several years, until thieves stole it and sold the metal for scrap. The story may have been true, but I have never seen it verified. However, it did cause our young imaginations to run wild, so we set out in search of the elusive quicksand. We followed the creek north, passing under the Lake Boulevard Bridge, and a short distance from the bridge we found what we thought was quicksand. We threw a few light sticks onto it and in a few seconds they vanished. However, this was not on the Burns property and therefore could not have been the site of the tragedy. True or not, I still remember that story even after all these many years. The last Burns listed as having lived in EARL was James N. Burns Jr. He was president of the Empire Trust Company. The year was 1910. Sometime between that year and 1932, the Sparta Land Company became owners of the estate, and began to subdivide it. The lots varied in size, many were an acre or more, and some were smaller. Land transaction records indicate that the first family to purchase a lot was Hyder Owen Heff Smith and his wife Hazel. They had a 5-year-old son, Hyder Owen Jr., whom they called Sam. On February 25, 1931, they purchased lot number 56. 3,901 watt, it was 2 lots south of where ours would be. During this period, Haidt was listed in the city directory as a musician, and also as a bellhop. He was an accomplished saxophone player. His final place of employment would be with the Quaker Oats Company. The following spring, on March 19, 1932, William and Jenny Allen purchased lot number 51. 3,812 watt, they built a brick house across the road from our future location. Their children were Mitchell, Elizabeth, Bill, Martha, Nellie, and Paul. 4 days after Allen's purchased their lot, Admiral Babcock and his wife bought lot number 64. 3,818 it was across the road from the back of our lot. I would like to point out, that was not his rank in the Navy, it was his name. Simon Peter Pete Hogan was born in 1880, and his wife, Emma Tina Wilson, in 1885. They were married September 6, 1902, at Bethany, Mo. They moved to St. Joe in 1910, and lived at 224 Clayton Street. In 1930, they and their 2 daughters and their families were renting the old Burns Castle. June 11, 1932, Pete and Tina purchased lot number 48, 3,820 watt. Pete was a good brick mason, so he and his 16-year-old son Walter J. Walt Hogan, and his 2 sons-in-law, constructed a 3-room brick house. The bricks may have came from the old Burns Castell that was in the process of being raised. Their eldest daughter Edith married Clarence Sprigg Sparks. They had 2 children, Clarence Jr., who was always known as Buddy, and Gwelda Lee. Clarence worked in construction as a carpenter all of his working life. For a number of years they lived at 2303 South 10th Street, across the alley from the Hickory Street Tavern. The second daughter of Pete and Tina Hogan was Gwelda Guy. She was born in 1907. She married Clarence L. Blue Sadler in 1928. Gwelda worked at Wyeth Hardware and Manufacturing, Company as a clerk, prior to her marriage. Blue was working at Swift Packing Company, and would remain there the rest of his working life. They were living on South 11th Street Road, when their son Lawrence Neal was born June 1, 1929. He would always go by his middle name, Neal. The house Ty were living in may have been the same house that my folks rented in 1928. Blue and Guy bought lot number 47, 3,902 watt, the next lot south of her parents. They first built a small frame house, but only lived in it a couple of years. Blue's dad was a carpenter by trade, and was probably involved in the construction of a larger 4-room house that they built nearby. They raised the smaller house during the construction of the new one, or soon after. Marvin Lewis Marv Hughes was born September 7, 1907, at Bethany, Missouri. He was the son of Raif and Lizzie Hughes. He had 2 brothers, Gene and Darrell, and 3 sisters, Opal Hughes Huckabee, Marjorie Hughes Woody, and Faye Hughes Cook. 15-year-old Mary left his home in Bethany in 1922, for a job painting bridges for the railroad. Mary met Loretta Rhett Hogan, the 3rd daughter of Pete and Tina Hogan, at the Harrison County Fair at Bethany, Missouri, in about 1927. They were married October 27, 1927. A son Louis Raymond was born October 28, 1929, he would go by the name of Ray his entire life. They also had a daughter, Joyce Elaine, born November 25, 1932. The Hogans, Sadlers, and Hughes had been living in the Burns Castle, just prior to constructing their homes. In 1933, Mary and his father-in-law Pete Hogan built a brick home for Red and Marv, on the north half of Pete's lot number 48. 3,818 watt, in the 30s, Mary became employed at the Armor Packing Company. There were times during the Depression years when work was scarce and layoffs would occur. During those lean times, Mary would go back to painting houses. He also cut the back off of his Model A Ford, converting it into a truck, and used it to haul coal to supplement his income during the Depression years. Throughout those years people were doing a variety of jobs just to survive. When World War II began, business picked up in the packing industry and his work became pretty steady from there on. He was employed there for about 30 years, and retired in 1972. On June 21, 1932, my grandpa and grandma Jarrett purchased lot number 55. 3816E. I found no record indicating that they ever owned property prior to this. At this point in time, they were 68 years of age. Grandpa built a 4-room house, with a large front porch that ran the width of it, and they had a porch swing that their grandkids whiled away many happy hours in. I can still see Grandma slowly swinging, while reading her Better Homes and Gardens and Good Housekeeping magazines. Uncle Lloyd was living with them, and was still a coremaker at the foundry. Uncle Ernie and Aunt Edna were living at 701 Shady Street, in the north part of town. Uncle Mike and Aunt Ruby were living at 821 Charles Street. He was a coremaker at the foundry. At this point in time the financial depression was taking hold of the nation in earnest. The situation was the same in Europe as well as the rest of the world, but Americans were looking for a scapegoat to lay the blame on, and they found it in Herbert Hoover, the poor boy who grew up in Iowa, and became President of the United States. The Republican was summarily dispatched in the November election, and was replaced by a Democrat, Franklin Roosevelt. He was an aristocratic millionaire from New York, and a cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. He immediately set about building a social welfare system that would weave itself into the fabric of America for generations to come. At this point in time, 63 years later, the national debt is $5 trillion and growing. The interest on the debt requires a fourth of all taxes collected annually, and continues to grow. There were so many federal agencies created by the socialist-leaning Roosevelt, that they became known as the alphabet agencies. _A Agricultural Adjustment MLB Maritime Labor Administration 1933 Board 1936 CAB Civil Aeronautics NEC National Emergency Board 1940 Council 1933 CCC Civilian Conservation NLRB National Labor Corps 1933 Relations Board 1935 CCC Commodity Credit Corporation NRA National Recovery 1933 Administration 1933. CSB Central Statistical NRPB National Resource Board 1933 Planning Board 1939. AFA Electric Home and YA National Youth Farm Authority 1935 Administration 1935. IB Export Import Bank PWA Public Works 1934 Administration 1933. FAA Federal Alcohol RA Resettlement Administration 1935 Administration 1935. FCA Farm Credit RIA Rural Electric Association Administration 1933 Administration 1935. FCC Federal Communications RFC Reconstruction Commission 1934 Finance Corp 1932. FSIC Federal Crop SEC Securities and Insurance Corporation 1938 Exchange Commission FARA Federal Emergency 1934. Relief Administration 1933 SMA Surplus Marketing FHA Federal Housing Administration 1940. Administration 1934 SSB Social Security FLA Federal Loan Agency Board 1935. 1939 TWA Tennessee FSA Farm Security Valley Authority 1937. Administration 1937 ISHA United States FSA Federal Security Housing Authority Agency 1939. USMC United States Agency 1939 Maritime Commission FWA Federal Works 1936. Agency 1939 WPA Works Progress Hulk Homeowners Administration Corp. 1933, 1935. Adolf Hitler, founder and leader of the National Socialist Party, took over as Chancellor of Germany, January 30, 1932, and a dictatorial tyrant was born. On November 29, 1932, Sheriff John Roach served a summons to Uncle Ernie, and on January 2, 1933, after 4 years of marriage, he and Aunt Edna were divorced. A few years later, this would prove to be a fateful decision for Edna. Ironically, her lawyer was William C. Cole, my mother's cousin who later became a U.S. congressman. On February 21, 1933, Dad purchased lot number 54, 3,813 watt, next to Grandpa and Grandma's. The cost of the lot was the huge sum of $500. Somehow they managed to make the payments. He decided to construct a large garage on the north edge of the lot, and build a house later when he could afford it. 63 years have passed and the house, garage, is still standing. Although additions have been made, the garage will probably always be the house. At some point in time when the housing development began, a road was built that branched off to the left of the one that ran up to the castle, thus making a fork or Y in the road. At that time ours was the second house from the Y, with our entrance off the west road. Some years later, another house was built to the north, making ours the third from the Y. Grandpa's was the next one southeast of ours, stretching from the east road to the west road. His house and entrance faced the east road, and bordered the length of our lot on the south. Grandpa had a corn field on the west half of his lot, and our garden was on the east half of our lot. The entrance to EARL was off the south side of Lake Boulevard. EARL was not in the city limits, but the north side of Lake Boulevard was. 20 days before Dad acquired our property, Uncle Mike and Aunt Ruby bought lot number 35, 735R, Riverview Drive located up the hill and to the west of us. If you cut across on foot it was about a quarter of a mile, but following the road it was about a half mile. It sat on a high ridge, and presented a great view of the Missouri River, and also Elwood, Kansas. To the north, you could see the downtown district of St. Joe. To the east you had an overview of the valley where we lived. They had a little girl that was born the same year that I was. Her name was Ruby Jean. She was crippled at birth and had to wear leg braces. To my knowledge she has remained in that condition all of her life. I have not seen her or had contact with her for over 40 years. The last time I heard, she was living in California and had several children. In the year of 1933 the building boom in EARL got off to a flying start. The same day that Dad bought our lot, Uncle Ray and Aunt Laverne bought lot number 60, 3820E, next to Grandpa's on the East Road. Their little Joanne was 5 years old when they moved into the small house that Grandpa built for them on the next lot south of them. Jody and I would spend our early years playing together every day. We played everything from paper dolls to cowboys and Indians. Some days we even played hooky from school. One of our favorite games was one that we called House. Joanne was the mama, and I was the daddy. She would mark out the rooms of our house with a stick in the dirt, and I would pretend that her little wagon was our car. Joanne was a quiet little girl and sort of shy around most people, and remained a reserved person as an adult. We dearly loved one another as kids, and having her as a playmate while growing up during the 30s, was a bright spot in my life. The following are some of the people that moved into EARL during the early to mid-30s. Roy Lee and Billy Wilson, lot number 521/2, 3804 Watt, on August 1, 1932. They had 3 children, Beverly, who was 7, and Billy Puddler, who I think was born about the time they moved there, and Glenda Kay, who was born in about 1936. Asia Ace Poe, bought lot number 46, 3904 Watt, the next place south of Sadler's, on February 23, 1933. He was a widower, who painted houses and hung paper for a living. On May 8, 1933, Lester and Luella Eaton bought lot number 56, 3905 Watt, at that time it was 2 houses up the hill from us. They had one son, Paul, who was about 7, and they later had another son whose name was Lee. During the year of 1935, Aunt Lucille and Uncle Virgil were divorced, after 4 children and 17 years of marriage. The only time that I recall having seen Uncle Virgil is one of my oldest memories. He hung wallpaper for a living, and was papering our house in about 1934 or 35. The reason the memory stayed with me was because he was born with one leg, and like my grandpa Slater, had a peg leg. After the divorce he went to Oklahoma, and sometime later his son Jarrett joined him there. Leslie Plumley bought lot number 33, on the 23rd of December 1935. They had 2 children, a son Carol, who was 9, and a daughter about my age. Their house sat on the east side of the creek, on South 11th Street Road. Another one of my oldest memories is July 8, 1935. I was standing out in our front yard, when a shiny car pulled up in front of the house and parked. And Dr. W. Roger Moore walked down through the yard. He had a black Clark Gable mustache, and carried a black satchel. I remembered being told that I was getting a new baby brother or sister. And I thought perhaps it was in the black bag, and it sure enough was. It turned out to be a little sister, and she had black hair and dark eyes, and resembled a little doll. And after 3 boys, Mom had finally got a baby girl. She was named Suzanne, a combination of Mom's 2 sisters, Susie and Ann. In about 1935, we went to Savannah to attend the Hearst family reunion. It was held at the Savannah City Park. Those were always enjoyable times, except the part when my great-aunts would give me a kiss and tell me how much I had grown. One of the reunions that stands out in my mind is the one that Uncle Earl's brother Everett Russell and family attended. They were not Hearst descendants, but were friends of Aunt Lou's family, including the Jarretts. We would occasionally take a Sunday drive with Aunt Lou and Uncle Earl up to Everett's farm near Maitland, Missouri. He had 3 sons, Gordon, Jake, and Eugene Jean, and a daughter Rebecca Becky. I think there were other children, but I'm not sure. I was pretty young back then. Bob, Bud, Jake, and Jean, and the rest of us would play in their big barn hayloft, swinging on the hay ropes and dropping into the loose hay. What fun we had back then. During the reunion, Gordon wanted to give us a ride in his new 1934 Chevy. He wanted to demonstrate how the new revolutionary suspension system, called knee action, worked. Uncle Earl and Dad, and Bob, Bud, and I, took our seats in the Chevy. Gordon headed east on Main Street passing the town square, and continued on crossing the Great Western Railroad tracks. He was picking up speed so he could hit the dip at the intersection of Main and 3rd Streets, to give us a demonstration of its smooth riding capabilities. It so happens that there was a metal stop sign in the center of the street that was a foot long and 6 inches high. It had been there for years, but Gordon had forgotten about it. We must have been doing 40 miles an hour when we hit it. There was a huge bang, and the passengers flew off their seats and banged their heads into the ceiling. Bob hit his head on the dome light and broke it out. We got out to access the damage, but everything seemed to be all right, except for a lump on Bob's head. We were impressed with the durability of the car but not the knee action ride. Family reunions were joyous occasions, attended by loved ones coming from near and far. Picnic baskets piled high with fried chicken, potato salad, macaroni and cheese, pies, cakes, homemade ice cream, and plenty of iced tea. These are the things memories are made of. One day in about 1936, Grandpa Jarrett took me up to 6th and Atchison Streets to watch the circus unload. I can recall how rough and calloused his hand felt as he walked along holding my hand. Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bailey were billed as the greatest show on earth. Everything was transported by railroad cars, and the unloading and hauling the short distance to the circus grounds was done with horse and elephant power. They had a parade the day after everything was set up. It wound through the downtown area and back down to the circus grounds. This was their way of advertising. Grandpa saw lots of people that he knew, and spoke to them. He had been a motorman on a trolley car, and I thought that was about the finest job a person could have. I can recall the trolley cars rumbling down South 6th Street, ringing their bells to warn people to get out of the way. It seemed to me like everyone in St. Joe was there milling around, and watching the circus unload. This is the only time that I recall Grandpa taking me anywhere, but I never forgot it. When Aunt Lou and Uncle Earl used to come for a visit on Sundays, it was an event. All of the neighborhood kids would come to gawk at their reflection in the big black shiny 1931 Oldsmobile. It had fender wells, and yellow wooden spoke wheels. It also had a luggage carrier rack on the back. They were our rich relatives, and we were real happy when they came for a visit. Uncle would always jingle the change in his pocket, and we would wait with bated breath for him to pull out some change. He would usually pop for a nickel for each of us. That was big money to us back then. In the summer when they came for a Sunday visit, Dad would drive over to the Artesian Ice Company to buy a block of ice. He would wrap it in a gunny sack and set it on the bumper. It would make a groove in it where it melted into the bumper, but it rode very well there. He would chip it up, and pack it around the ice cream mixer cylinder, then sprinkle salt in with chipped ice and then place a gunny sack over the top to hold the cold in. We also used the versatile gunny sack for a doormat. Bob, and Bud, would do most of the cranking on the mixer handle. I would crank it some at the start, but the more you cranked the harder the handle turned. When it got to that point I would set on top of the freezer to hold it down, while they cranked it to completion. We always made the ice cream out in the front yard under the shade of the big old maple trees. What happy times those were. Back then few people had electric refrigerators, they had ice boxes. A truck from the Artesian Ice Company drove through the neighborhood delivering ice. We had a card that hung on the front of our house, that had 25, 50, 75, and 100, in each corner of it. You put the number to the top, to indicate how many pounds of ice you wanted. The Iceman had a rubber apparatus that hung over his shoulders and part way down his back. It protected him from the cold wet ice. He would pull a block from his truck with his ice tongs, and swing it over his shoulder onto the back pad. He would then carry it in and place it in our icebox that sat on the back screened-in porch. For a few cents more he would crush it in the power takeoff grinder that was attached to the big truck. Then he would carry it in on his shoulder in a metal basket. I always figured icemen were strong guys and that I would like to do that when I grew up. Mom and Dad and Aunt Lou and Uncle Earl would set up their card table in the front yard under the maples, and play pinochle for what seemed like hours. I always liked for Aunt Lou to entertain me, and I looked forward to the end of the card game. I never liked to play cards and did very little of it during my life, and that was probably the reason why. The Jarrett family reunions were fun times. They usually took place in August at Hyde Park. The one that stands out most in my memory was the one held on August 16, 1936. Mom was the only one absent. When we arrived home late that afternoon we had a new baby brother. He came exactly 1 year, 1 month, 1 week, and 1 day after Susie was born. He was as blonde as Susie was dark. He was named Jerry Dwayne, and his hair was so light that we called him Cotton. However, as he grew older, it gradually became darker. His middle name was our paperboy's first name, Dwayne Stevens. With the rapid increase in the size of our family, our little 3-room house had shrunk considerably. Mom was faced with the dauntless task of potty training one toddler, and had one in the crib. I can recall her scrubbing diapers on her old washboard until her knuckles were red. She did this for all 6 of her children. As I write, I am looking at that old washboard hanging on the wall of my study, and remember the love that I know she felt for each of her babies whose diapers she scrubbed on it. I am reasonable sure it is at least 80 years old, at this point in time. Mom perfected a new system the following summer after Jerry was born that helped to speed up the potty training. Whenever he filled his diaper out in the yard, she would stick the garden hose down in the back of it, and flush it out. He didn't like that at all, so it didn't take long to get him housebroke, and at the same time it cleaned him up. I felt sorry for the little guy. He had eczema and would scratch it until it bled. Mom would have to tie his hands to the sides of his crib to keep him from scratching. One day a week was always set aside for wash day. Mom would heat a boiler of water on the kitchen stove. Then she would dip it into the old square Maytag wringer washer. Then 2 tubs of cold rinse water, one containing a solution called bluing, and the other clear water. She would pile a load of dirty clothes, white ones first, into the washing machine, and add oxydol soap. After they had washed for a period of time, she would run them through the wringer and into the tub of blue water that would make them whiter, and then into the clear final rinse, and then back through the wringer and into the clothes basket. She would then hang them out on the clothesline in the yard. The dresses, aprons, and shirts were held back to be dipped into a mixture of starch and boiling water. The dirty overalls were the last things to be washed. The following day, she would stand at the ironing board, all day long ironing the starched clothes. It was a grilling job keeping clothing clean and neat for her family. In June of 1936, the city directory listed 47 families living in EARL. They were the following: Allen, William J. Lot number 50, 3,812 watts, Moore, Dials Lot number 68, Allen Brand, Chaz. C. Lot number 53, Parker, Floyd I. Lot number 33, Babcock, Admiral D. 3,813 E. Parker, Tillman G. Lot number 37, Bird, William E. Lot number 96, Parker, William A. Lot number 29, Bonner, Mark Lot number 38, Plumley, Abram L. Lot number 85, Kavanaugh, Leo W. Lot number 98, Poe, Asia Lot number 46, 3,904 Watt, Kaufman, Everett F. Lot number 39, Poe, Lloyd L. Lot number 44, Cox, Geo, W. Lot number 72, Price, Chaz. W. Lot number 5, Dilliman, J. Cleve Lot 62, 3815 E. Ratliff, Lewis E. Lot number 31, Eaton, Lester H. Lot number 561/2, 3,905 watts, Richardson, W. L. Lot number 77, Elliott, Jessup Lot number 11, Sadler, Clarence L. 3,902 watt, Farrell, Thoss. B. Lot number 27, Scott, Chaz. M. Lot number 30, Fur, Donald B. Lot number 6, House moved, Smith, Hyder O. 3,901 watts, Griffin, John W. Lot number 36, Stout, William E. Lot number 79, Hogan, Simon P. Lot number 48, 38,201 halves of a watt, Swartz, John J. Lot number 52, Hughes, Marvin L. Lot number 481/2, 3,820 watts, Teichman, Robert A. Lot number 4, Jarrett, John L. Lot number 55, 3816 E, Van Sickle, Earl A. 802 or Jarrett, J. Lloyd Lot number 551/2, 3,815 watts, Wagenicht, Ray, 3,820, Jarrett, Lester A. Lot number 54, 3,813 watts, Wagner, Walter Lot number 78, Jarrett, Marcus L. Lot number 35, 735 or Walpole, John R. Lot number 14, Keeley, Richard Lot number 40, Webb, Leo Lot number 104, King, J. Elmer Lot, Wilford, Oscar B. Lot number 28, Mace, William H. Lot number 26, Wilson, Roy L. 3,804, Meester, John J. Lot number 41, 4,014 watt, Lawrence Richardson Purchase Lot number 89, January 10, 1936, I don't recall whether or not they had children. May 4, 1936, John J. and Helen Wilson, Swartz, purchased lot 521 halves, 3,802 watt, next door north of her brother Roy Wilson, lot 521 halves, 3,804 watt. Helen and Roy were first cousins of Guelda Sadler and Loretta Hughes. They had two sons, Johnny Jr., who was about 4, and Jimmy Ray, who was born the same year they moved in. They would later have a daughter Janie, born in about 1944. In the early 40s, Helen's parents, Bert and Mert Wilson, would build a small house behind Helen's. Mert was Tina Hogan's sister. Lloyd Parker bought lot number 94, December 17, 1936, the same day Clarence G. Parker bought lot number 105. To the north of 735 are Bill and Virgil, were sons of one of these two. Eddie and Dorothy Sherman bought lot number 53, 3,800 watt, on October 14, 1936. Their house was located at the Y, where the east and west roads parted. They were our next neighbors to the north at that time, but several years after we left EARL another house was built on the lot in between them. They had a son born there. He was named Edward Paul. They later had a daughter, after moving from EARL. Eddie drove a truck for Watson Brothers, and Dorothy was a wrapper at Swift Packing Company. Eddie was a very rotund fellow, and one day his bulk was too much for his privy floor, and he dropped out of sight. For a while it looked as though they would have to summon a tow truck to extract him from his place of confinement. He was shunned for quite some time. Walter L. Boots Richardson and his wife Frances purchased lot number 77, 901R, located on the left side, at the top of hill on the West Road. The land records show that they purchased the property October 3, 1937. However, the city directory listed them as EARL residents in 1936. Mrs. Richardson had one son by a previous marriage. His name was Eugene. Boots had two daughters by a previous marriage. They were Mary Louise and Martha. The children they had together were Dugan, Dorothy, Luke Budgie, Helen Joyce, Judy, Joanne, Ronnie, Steve, and Tammy. Mrs. Richardson was 50 years old when she had Tammy. Boots and Frances had a grand total of 12 children between them. They were married to one another twice during their lifetime. When Uncle Lloyd married Aunt Bessie, she had a daughter Betty who was about 7 or 8, and a boy they called Sonny who was about 5. I will always remember our first encounter when I was about 6. Uncle Lloyd brought his new family down to Grandma and Grandpa's to meet the family. I was standing up at the end of their driveway in front of Grandpa's garage. I can still see that big old car turning into the driveway. It seems to me like it was a Nash, probably about a 1929 model, and it had high solid steel wheels, and was a faded maroon color. As soon as they got out, Sonny came up to where I was standing by a couple of sawhorses in front of Grandpa's garage. We said a few words, and I was trying to be a good host to my new cousin. He had a stick in his hand playing with it, when out of the blue he assaulted me by slugging me over the head with it, and blood commenced to flow freely down my brow. This really wasn't a very diplomatic gesture on his part, and needless to say our relationship got off to a rocky start. In 1936, Uncle Lloyd, with the help of Grandpa and my dad, and probably his other brothers, built a 3-room house on the back of Grandpa's lot next door to us. After that, Sonny and I went at it about every day. My mother said she would look out her window and see our heads bobbing up and down and our arms flailing away, in the weeds that proliferated Uncle Lloyd's backyard. She would call me home and give me a reprimand, but no paddling. She knew how ornery he was, and would just tell me it's not nice to fight. His older sister Betty would also create some excitement occasionally. One day when Aunt Lou Verne was away from home, Betty paid her a visit. She raided the icebox and ran water all over the floor, making a real mess of things. Needless to say, Auntie was more than a little put out. One bitter cold day in the winter of 1936, Uncle Lloyd picked Betty up after school, and I rode home with them. He had a green Dodge, about a 1930 model. Its radiator froze up on the way home and was boiling over. When we got there, he parked it on the road in front of his house, headed downhill. This was done in order to coast start it the next morning. Sometimes when it was extremely cold, people would fill a tub with hot coals from the heating stove, and set it under the oil pan of the engine, in order to heat the oil. This enabled the engine to crank easier. Uncle Lloyd unscrewed the radiator cap and went in the house. When I saw the smoke coming from the radiator, I put my hand over it to keep it from escaping. That was the moment that I learned that steam is not smoke. Mom put butter, oleo, on my blistered hand. I soon found that by staying out on the cold porch I got a little relief from the excruciating pain. It was a day I'll never forget. They lived there until 1938, when they moved to the Pacific Northwest. At that time the title to the property was transferred from Grandpa to Uncle Lloyd. That was the last time that I ever saw Sonny and Betty again. Uncle Lloyd and Aunt Bessie came back this way for a couple of visits, but that was the only time that we saw them again. Ernie and Leona Elder apparently rented the house. They had a son Larry, who was about 3 at the time. One summer my cousin Billy Mack came down from Savannah to spend a few days with us. I was about 9 and Billy was about 10. We thought it would be entertaining to give Larry some X-Lax and told him it was candy. Things went well for us until Mom got wind of what had taken place. Needless to say we got into a lot of trouble over that little escapade, and Larry was also in a lot of trouble until the laxative wore off. Today he is the chairman of the Buchanan County Democrat Central Committee. Had I known back then what he would grow up to be, I would have relished the punishment I received and would probably have doubled the dosage. Back then I thought as a child and didn't know the difference between a Democrat and a Republican, but I sure do now. He probably needed a good physic to purge him. It was November 13, 1936, when Jim and Mary Hill bought lots number 10, 3718A. They had 2 sons, Alan Coster, who was from a previous marriage. He was about 12 and his little half-brother whose name was Larry Hill, was about my age. He and I played together some, and a few ball games took place on their lot. Mary was Blue Sadler's sister. There were 5 houses full of Jarretts, and 6 full of Hogans and their relatives. Sometime around 1936, John Meister brought lot number 41, 4014 Watt. I don't remember his wife, he may not have had one at the time. She could have been deceased, or they could have been divorced. I believe that during the war years he worked on the Alaska Road, or pipeline. His children that I can recall were Sonny, he may have been Junior, Donald, Bobby, and possibly a daughter, Lois. There may have been more, but these are the ones that I can recall. We never played together very often, however we did smoke together occasionally in the tree house, when Donnie and Bobby could come up with some cigarettes. We were younger than Sonny so he didn't run with us. Charles and Margaret Clark Allen Brand lived next door to Aunt Lou Verne. They had 3 boys, Clark, James, J.L., and Paul. Margaret was a sister to Dorothy Sherman. Clarky, was a year older than me, and J.L. was my age. I don't recall Paul, he must have been younger. I played with them occasionally. They had a milk cow, and one day, Bob and Bud, Sam Smith, Paul Eaton, and Bill Allen, decided to be rodeo riders and took several rides on the old cow before we were ran off their place. They were the older kids and from time to time they would allow me to tag along with them. This is where I received my higher education. All that was required of me was to keep my ears and eyes open and my mouth shut. By the time I was 12 years old I had my Ph.D. in smoking, the birds and the bees, and other related subjects. On September 7, 1936, an earth-shaking event took place in my young life. Bob and Bud's summer vacation was over and they were starting their 6th grade of school. This would be their final year at McKinley Elementary School and next year they would start junior high at Benton High School. It was located about a mile south of McKinley, at the top of a high hill just to the south of King Hill Overlook. This year would be different for them, they would be taking their little brother along with them. This would be the day that I would be leaving the security of our little home in EARL to venture out into the big world. My life would never be quite the same again. We climbed the hill up West EARL Road and took a short cut through Lake's property, then we crossed a field where we came to a large oak tree. From there the path wound down a hillside through Obluitzel's farm. Ending at the east end of Kansas Avenue we climbed through a barbed wire fence and walked 2 blocks down the street. There before my terrified eyes stood a 2-story brick building that looked enormous and foreboding. The total trip had been about 1 mile. Bud, being the younger of my 2 older brothers, usually was delegated the task of riding herd on me, So he took me by the hand and we climbed the long concrete stairs to the top. There I came face to face with two giant doors. We entered and climbed another set of stairs to reach the ground floor. To our right was the first grade classroom. When we entered, everyone was already seated, and while my big brother was introducing me to Miss Pollock, I turned away from them and faced the blackboard so the kids wouldn't see me crying. In that sea of smirking faces, there was not one that I recognized. When the bell rang at lunchtime, all of the kids filed out of the room. Bud had told the teacher that he had my lunch and would take me to the lunchroom. Brother was late getting there and I was about to come unglued when he finally arrived. He took me down into that huge cavern of a basement. Mom always fixed our lunches, and wrapped it in newspaper and tied it with twine. Most of the kids had bologna sandwiches, but Mom always made us tuna salad, or ground bologna with pickles, mayonnaise and lettuce. There would also be a couple of cookies, and an apple or orange. Even in the Depression years, she had a knack of turning a simple school lunch into a gourmet feast. She also made sure that we wore clean clothes to school, and it seemed like she was always mending them. This was the way that my first day of school started, and as you will see as time went by, it didn't get any better. In 1937, something happened that changed Dad's career more than anything since the day he started work as a messenger for Hirsch Brothers back in 1911. The Berry Foundry and Manufacturing Company was purchased by the Locomotive Finished Material Company of Atchison, Kansas. Mr. John Marr was brought in from Ohio as the plant manager. Dad was a foreman at the time and was made superintendent. Also that year, William Lynn Jarrett was born January 21, 1937. Uncle Mike and Aunt Ruby adopted him immediately after his birth. His biological mother was Carol, and according to my parents, his father was Uncle Mike. She had at least one other son, a boy about my age whose name was Keith Carroll. I attended school with him in the lower grades for a short time at McKinley. Billy Lynn and Ruby Jean spent a lot of time playing with us at Grandma and Grandpa's house. Jerry and Bill were about the same age and they played together a lot. On February 16, 1937, Leigh Eaton bought lot number 57, 3,905 Watt, the next place south of him. He and a co-worker at the St. Joseph Structural Steel Company, Ludwig Detweiler, built a frame house on the lot. It was made from sawmill lumber and, like many of the homes built in the Depression, was covered with tar paper. I don't know whether Ludwig bought it, or rented it from Leigh. He had a wife and a son, Paul. On the 18th of March, 1937, Frank Witham and his wife purchased lot number 85, 1114 BV, located on the road that made a loop on the south end of EARL, now called Boulevard View. Orville Richards and his wife bought lots number 81 and number 82, 4009 Watt, on February 6, 1937. I think they lived there. Herschel Sweetheart and his wife, Hazel, purchased lot number 11, next house north of 3802, August 22, 1937. This was 4 days before my 7th birthday. They had a son named Bobby, who was about a year old at that time. I can recall the cavernous basement of Old McKinley School. It contained the restrooms, a cafeteria, and a lunchroom. In the cafeteria, you could purchase a hot lunch and milk. However, it was a rare occasion when I was afforded this luxury. The lunchroom was for kids that carried their lunches, but not for the rich kids. Translation: those whose dads had steady work, or small families. They ate hot lunches in the cafeteria. The lunchroom had whitewashed walls and wooden benches and tables, and that was the extent of its decor. The eating rooms were located at the east end of the hall, and the restrooms and furnace and boiler room were at the west end. The basement ran the entire length of the school building, but not under the attached gymnasium. After finishing with lunch, we went out to the playgrounds and would stay until the bell rang. We would then enter the building and use the restrooms if needed, then go to our classrooms. One of my most embarrassing moments in life happened one day when I was in about the 3rd or 4th grade. I may have had colon trouble even back then. It seems like I had diarrhea all through my school years, and needless to say, this created some tense and embarrassing moments. I will never forget the day that I was on the playgrounds after lunch and I asked the teacher that was monitoring us if I could go to the restroom. She said that I would have to wait until the bell rang. Soon my bowels overtook me and I asked her once again. No doubt she had stood close enough to me to realize what had happened. She granted me permission, probably in an attempt to effect some post-bowel damage control. But she had been an hour late and $1 short with the grant. I had little success with the damage control. And as the bell rang that summoned the kids to the restrooms, I made a hasty retreat from there and hurried up the hall to the drinking fountains. As they entered the restroom, a steady stream of them came rushing back out into the hall, pinching closed their nostrils with their thumb and index finger. I felt a great deal of guilt and shame for having been responsible for disrupting the entire male student body of McKinley School. I furiously and stealthily slipped up the stairs and entered the classroom. When the rest of the kids came into the room, I realized that I hadn't been as clandestine as I had thought. The teacher began to stroll around through the classroom in an attempt to ferret out the perpetrator of this foul deed, and it wasn't long before she honed in on me. My heart nearly stopped beating when she paused at my desk and said, "James, would you please step out into the hall?" At that moment my self-esteem plummeted to new depths. I was totally mortified. She told me I could go home for the day, and thank goodness she didn't mention the reason why. It's no wonder that I always hated school. As I write this, I am doubled up with laughter, but believe me, at that time in my life it was no laughing matter. The teachers at McKinley during the last half of the 30s and early 40s were Miss Pollock, 1st grade Miss Carpenter, 2nd Miss Webster, 3rd Miss Bowen, 4th Miss Bacon, 5th Miss Laura Lauch-Singer, 6th Miss Whitney, 7th Miss Margaret Muir was one of my teachers in the upper grades. Miss Zimmerman was the gym, physical ed, teacher. Miss Ruth Bale was the music teacher. Miss Ritchie was the principal for the first few years, followed by Miss Ruby Moore. Mr. Pepper was the custodian and part-time disciplinarian. Back in those days, female teachers could not be married, and many remained single their entire lives. In today's world, the baby boomers and their offspring, the step generation and the women's liberation movement, those standards would have been subverted, merely by living together without getting married. Or it would have been overruled by a federal judge, or adjudicated to death by the many lawyers that proliferate the justice system. Back then, society did not sanction single people living together as man and wife. In those days, moral standards were much higher than they are today. I'm not trying to sound sanctimonious, I'm just stating a fact. The Withams had a son, Ronald, who was about my age. Mrs. Witham drove him to McKinley School. Sometimes I would go over to Aunt Lou Verne's and Mrs. Witham would stop and honk for Cousin Jody and I, and we would get a ride to school. A few times when Aunt Lou Verne was at work, Jody and I would have hearing problems when she honked, and we would play hooky, a term used back then, when a kid skipped school. Jody didn't like school any better than I did, so we thought it would be much more fun to stay at home and play. This tactic didn't go over real big with either of our mothers. We would then be forced to revert back to our old standby, the 1-hour flu. I can't remember the first time I met Nick Sadler and his first cousin, Louis Hughes. They had always been around as far as my memory goes back. I tagged them with their nicknames. I named Neil Nick Knuckles, because that sounded like a tough guy, and I named Ray Louis Slaver, for the same reason. They named me Trigger Doom, after the bad guy in the newspaper comic strip, Dick Tracy. They shortened mine too, Trig, and we have called one another by these names all of our lives. We would spend countless hours together the first 16 years of our lives and were more like brothers than neighbors. Louis's sister Joyce Elaine and Suzanne were together constantly, and remained friends all through their lives. They were constantly followed around and teased by little brother Jerry. They looked forward to a fight about every day. When Nick, Louis, and Joyce Elaine started to school, they went to Neely, on South 12th Street. Their older cousins, Bud and Gwelda Lee Sparks, were attending Neely, and that was probably the reason that their folks sent them there. Nick and Louis started a year before I did, and when I started, the folks sent me to McKinley because Bob and Bud went there. I think that I may have liked school better if Nick and Louis had gone to school with me. It would be 7 years before we would attend the same school at Benton High. Unfortunately, that accident that I mentioned earlier was not the last one. Many nights coming home from school, the pangs would hit me at about the time I reached the big oak tree at the top of the hill. I would increase my pace to a fast walk, stopping occasionally to regain my composure. When I arrived at Lake's house, I would break into a frantic dash for home. By the time I got to Jackson's, I would realize that any attempt to make it home would be futile. I would cut off of the road and fly across the greater ditch to Jackson's outhouse. Sometimes I would make it, sometimes I wouldn't. This did have its upside though. I was the fastest kid in EARL during that run. However, I could never hit the speed in a regular foot race that I did in my desperate dash for Jackson's privy. I also had a run-in with a urinal in the school restroom. I was running for it, when I fall head first into it, splitting my head open. It seems as though I was plagued by misfortune around toilets. One day Louie and I got the bright idea to write with chalk, a new 4-letter word that we had added to our limited vocabulary, one that pertained to a subject that we knew very little about. We let our artistic inspirations flow freely, by printing it all over the walls of the privy, and on the boardwalk leading to it. My mother certainly did not appreciate our literary genius. We received a stern lecture and spent the afternoon with scrub rags and a pan of soapy water, destroying our work. However, Louie and I vowed to pursue more enlightenment about the forbidden word. And I'm proud to say that we spent the next few years conducting research on it. We also found outhouses a source of delight and a prime target on Halloween, but that's another story for later on. One of the most popular games that we played in school was marbles. During recess and noon break, one could see countless marble games going on. A circle was marked in the dirt, and we would place a certain number of marbles in the center of the circle. Then each player in turn would shoot from the edge of the ring. If you knocked a marble out and your shooter marble, remained in the circle, you could continue shooting until you ran all of the marbles, where your went out, then the next player would shoot. Games could be played for keeps, or for fun. Taws were every boy's most prized possession. The ones made of flint rock were sought after, coveted and guarded judiciously. One good flint could be traded for several glass marbles. If you were a good enough player you could compete for the school championship and go on to compete in the city tournament. I never played good enough for either one. Other games that we played were softball, dodgeball, yo-yos, and spinning tops. You played tops by winding a string around it, and throwing it on the ground and watching it spin. However, that didn't suit us. We made up a game that we called spike. The object was to spike the other kid's top, and stop it from spinning. Our neighbor Leigh Eaton was a colorful fellow. He was a large bald-headed man, who always had a big lump of Copenhagen in his lip. I sometimes wondered if he slept with it there. He had an old woodworking shop in his backyard, made of rough-cut lumber. He made tops on his wood lathe, and gave them to the neighborhood kids. We were quite proud of them and would sharpen the points that were made from a nail. Occasionally a top would split during a game, but we could usually talk Leigh into making us another one. He would sometimes take his son Paul and the rest of the neighborhood kids swimming at the Platte River. For his grown-up cronies, he would use his jigsaw to make phallic tea towel and pot holders, that they could hang in their kitchens, Noof said. One of our favorite days in school was Valentine's Day. All of the kids would bring valentines and place them in a decorated valentine box. If a boy and a girl liked one another, everyone would watch closely when theirs were handed out to them. If it was a sweet one, everyone would tease them. The teacher would also have us make valentines for our mothers. Another fun day was when we had a taffy pull. The teacher would heat a mixture of caramel, sugar, and syrup. We would powder our hands with flour, then pull, and stretch it. Did we wash the hands? I don't recall, probably not. She would then cut the taffy into individual pieces and serve it. Shirley Callison was a girl that sat in front of me, and one day I decided to dip one of her pigtails in my inkwell. Needless to say, that didn't set too well with her. She lived over on South 11th Street, and I would walk behind her on our way home, teasing her all the way. I gave her the nickname of Fritz. It would make her mad when I called her that. I really don't think she was mad, but she would let on like she was. We remained good friends all through our school years. Her big sister Marion and my big brother Bob had a thing going for a while, but nothing serious ever came of it. Of course, Christmas was always a time of the year that we eagerly looked forward to. It was a time for plays and pageants. This was long before we were forbidden by the U.S. government to have anything religious in public schools. We always wished for a big snow during Christmas vacation so that we could sled ride down the West EARL Hill. These outings would last all day and into the evening. What fun times those were! During my third year of school, I was having trouble with arithmetic. Miss Webster was working with me after school, trying to get the arithmetic to sink in. She happened to glance out the window and saw Mr. Pepper leaving the school after locking us in. In a fit of panic, she quickly raised the window and shouted at him. He heard her and returned and unlocked the door, and we quickly exited the building. We came close to spending the night together. What a scary thought that was. I was somewhat afraid of her. She had a face as long as a mule's, and lips as thick as a garden hose. She was probably a dear sweet lady who was only trying to help a dimwit kid learn something. Occasionally she would give me a ride part way home in her 1931 Chevy Coupe. I would ride with her up King Hill Avenue, to Lake Boulevard, and walk the remainder of the way home. When winter began to wane, and pale greens began to appear on the hillsides, I would usually start pestering Mom. Mom, can I go barefooted? This would usually go on for several days before she would relent and off would come the shoes. That was when I knew that summer vacation was just around the corner. Finally the great day would arrive and grade cards would be handed out. The dismissal bell would ring and we would be off and running. Here and there you could hear rhymes being recited. No more school, no more books, no more cross-eyed teachers' looks. And another old favorite, school out, teacher let the monkeys out. In that moment of exuberance it seemed like the summer would last forever and the coming of autumn and returning to school would be no more. Dad used to be a hardball catcher and we spent some of our Sunday afternoons watching him play. They played on a field next to the Artesian Ice Company on South 4th Street. That was sometime in the mid-30s and early 40s. We spent many summer evenings over at the South Park Softball Diamond. Night games under the lights was something fairly new. Mom would pop a large sack of popcorn and bring along a large container of iced tea. We sat on a blanket in the outfield, just beyond the fence. I usually fell asleep before the game ended. Those were happy, carefree days. There were several teams in the Industrial League that competed and after nearly 60 years, I can still recall some of them, and even the colors of their uniforms. The Swafford Motor Company had green and white, Wyeth Hardware and Manufacturing, red, white, and blue, Dugdale Packing Company orange and black, Getz Brewery, red and white. The other lighted ballpark in town was on the corner of St. Joseph Avenue and Kearns Toad. It was owned by the Giotts Brewery, but we seldom went up there. One of my finest hours took place when I was about 5 or 6 years old. It was the famous Rock Up the Nose incident. It took place on a hot summer Sunday when there was a sizable gathering of relatives from Savannah. Those that I recall being there were Aunt Lou and Uncle Earl, Lois, and Bill Mack, and Billy. Billy and I were playing under one of the big maple trees, when I picked up a small rock. Don't ask me why, but I suppose it was to show how clever I was. I shoved the rock deeply up one of my nostrils. When I tried to retrieve it, I only embedded it much deeper into the cavity. It was at this point in time that I realized that I was in deep doo-doo. I went into the house and announced what I had done. Various methods were employed to make the extraction, including holding me over the stove with a pan of boiling water loaded with black pepper. I went into a fit of sneezing but failed to dislodge the object of my torment. By this time I had lost my composure and was squalling like a pig caught under a fence. They loaded me into the old whippet and started searching for a doctor. I don't remember how they ever located one on Sunday afternoon, but they did. We met him at his office and I was pretty scared and had no idea what he would do to me. He used an instrument that looked like needle-nose pliers, and with little effort removed it. I was told never to put anything up my nose again. All down through the years I have followed his orders except for maybe my pinky finger. Dad used to take Bob, Bud, and I, fishing out to the Platte River. I fondly recall one afternoon when we were heading home in the old whippet. We were rounding a curve on the old Saxton Road, when suddenly things got very exciting. A bee crawled up Dad's pant leg and he commenced clawing and shouting. He nearly wrecked the car before he brought it to a stop. He bailed out and started jumping around like a grasshopper in a chicken pen. His 3 boys couldn't stop laughing all the way home. We were so entertained by his performance that we never did let him forget it. Another stunt that Dad performed that we never forgot, was the time when he decided to show us that he could crawl between the arms of our dining room chair. He managed to get his head and shoulders through, then discovered he was stuck fast. And then came a knock at the door. Mom answered the door, and returned saying that an insurance agent had arrived for his appointment with Dad. I'm not sure, but I believe they had to remove the arms from the chair to free him. Needless to say, Dad was a bit embarrassed trying to explain his predicament to the insurance man. Of course, we never let him forget that one either. During the winter of 1936 there was a big ice storm, and I can recall watching out window as Bob and Bud flew down through the front yard and went up and over the cellar and on down through the backyard. They were using the old clamp-on ice skates. It was like a giant skating rink everywhere and all the kids were out skating. It was at this time that Dad was gingerly making his way out to the privy to empty the thunder mug, when he slipped and down he went pot and all. The only injury sustained was to his dignity, and yes, we never let him forget that mishap either. One of Bob and Bud and their pals' favorite pastimes was taking hikes. I can recall begging them to take me along. Sometimes with Mom's urging they would. We usually headed south down the old interurban right-of-way where the St. Joe, Kansas City train used to run. It was about a quarter-mile east of our house and I vaguely recall seeing it going down the tracks. It made its final run in 1934, when I was 4 years old. On one such hike I remember of us going over a concrete overpass that spanned the Southwest Boulevard. They decided to stop for a rest in a grove near the boulevard. The subject of my brothers and their pals' conversations were about several white rubber things that littered the area. I could tell that most of their talk was centered around these objects. When we left to continue our hike I poked a stick into one of the floppy objects and carried it along on the hike until I tired of it, and tossed it away. I vowed to investigate these things a little more, Noof said. We continued on to the Ajax Junction. On the return trip we went skinny dipping in a farm pond and I got to take a dip in the shallow part. It was a hot summer day and the water felt cool and nice. On the final leg of the journey my short legs gave out on me and big brother Bud carried me on his back. It seems as though he was always there to give me a lift when I needed it all during our lives. Just behind Alan Band's pasture on the east slope of the old Burns Castle Hill, Bob and Bud and their gang built a log cabin. It was constructed out of small limbs and the inner walls were covered with cardboard from boxes they had scavenged. Somewhere they came up with an old stove. They dug a hole in the dirt floor and installed a trapdoor. This was where they stored their pilfered coal supply. One day we were up at the cabin smoking our acorn pipes. This ingenious instrument was created by cutting an acorn in half and removing the inner part with our pocket knives. Then we cut a hole in it for a stem. The stem was made by hollowing out a dry weed and inserting it in the hole in the acorn. Then we were ready for business. Most of the time we acquired our tobacco by shooting snipes, used cigarette butts from our dad's ashtrays. On this particular day I was fresh out of snips so I decided to improvise. Somehow we had managed to acquire some old dried up Copenhagen snuff tobacco. Part of a can had dried out on Lay Eaton and he had thrown it away. His loss was our gain. I proceeded to fill up the old pipe, and started puffing away. I had not been at it very long before my eyes started to cross and the cabin began to spin, and I lost my breakfast. I can recall starting down the hill toward home, and by then my face had turned to an ash-colored green. Of all days that I would decide to experiment with new tobacco, this was the worst. The folks had planned a trip to Savannah to visit Aunt Lou and Uncle Earl. Needless to say the trip had to be cancelled. I don't recall Mom and Dad ever discovered the source of my sudden illness. It was about this time that Joe Fender and family began their move up the social ladder when they moved into EARL from Florence Addition. They had 6 kids, Joe Jr., Karen, Ethel, Ann, John, and Art. Some of the older ones were already married. I think John, Annie, and Art were the only ones still at home. John was Bob and Bud's age, and Art was about a year older than me. They lived up on the hill in a brick house behind where the castle once stood. Art and I played together some, and I recall the day that he and I were playing and Art went behind an old frame house that stood vacant near their house. He was back there passing water or doing something when a wasp stung him on his appendage in hand. Art came out squalling like a scalded dog, still clutching his member as he headed for the house at top speed. His mother applied first aid and by this time the appendage had swollen to a prodigious dimension. For a couple of days he strutted around like a prize bull, showing off his wound at every opportunity. After a couple of days the swelling went down and he was healed. The moral of the story is, never unsheath tour equipment near a wasp nest, Noof said. Sometime after Uncle Ernie's divorce from Edna, he moved to Atlanta, Georgia. He married a woman from there, her name was Nina. Even as a small boy I could see that she was a beautiful lady. I don't recall what her maiden name was. Uncle Ernie passed away February 17, 1939, at Atlanta, Georgia. The cause of his death was pneumonia. He was 34 years, 4 months, and 19 days old. Nina accompanied his body back to St. Joseph. I recall when we went to the Fleeman Funeral Home to view the body. This was the first one that I had ever seen and was the first time that I became aware of death. I recall standing at the open casket with Dad and what he said to me. He said, "Sonny, you should always get along with your brothers and be good to one another." I don't recall of ever hearing Dad use the word love during his lifetime. It just wasn't the way that the Jarrett men talked, although I'm sure that's what he was trying to tell me. I think he may have been sorry for any hard feelings that he may have had with his little brother. I strongly suspect there had been some down through the years and he knew that there was no way that he could go back and change anything. It was an experience and lesson that has stuck with me throughout my life. I vowed then never to have a falling out with any of my brothers and sisters, and in my last quarter of life I have cautiously began to express my love to my family members. Up to recent years my wife is the only one that I ever told that to. Aunt Nina remained a short time with Grandma and Grandpa, then she returned to Georgia. To my knowledge none of the family ever heard from her again. One era we went through was playing with rubber guns and slug guns. We made large rubber bands from an old car inner tube, a pincher cloth's pin and sawed a gun out of a piece of 1-inch wood. We would stretch the rubber band down the length of the barrel and it was held in a cocked position with the clothespin. When you squeezed it the rubber band was released and went flying at a stinging speed. We would choose up sides and have a war. Slug guns were made about the same way, however the rubber band was nailed to the end of the gun. We made small rectangular wooden slugs that were propelled by the rubber band. These were a little dangerous to be shooting at each other and we normally did not use them in our wars. I can remember following Bob, Bud, and Cousin Jarrett Young around, watching them shoot their slug guns. They went up on the hill where the Burns Castle had previously stood. There was an old rusty sleigh setting there that had about succumbed to the elements. I was probably about 5 years old and Bob and Bud were about 10 and 11, and Jarrett was about 14. At the time I don't recall who was living up there in the brick carriage house that stood to the ear of where the castle once stood, but I think it was Wagner's, and Eugene was the son's name. How fortunate I feel to have had the opportunity to grow up during the final last 2 decades of the steam locomotive. We lived about a mile from the Chicago, Burlington, Quincy railroad yards and roundhouse. This was where they overhauled the steam locomotives. They had a turntable that rotated 360 degrees. It was used to turn the locomotives around, so that they could work on them. It was their main yard where they did all of their switching to make up trains. From where we lived we could hear the distant sound of boxcars banging into one another and the toot of whistles and bells clanging, as the cars were being shuffled around and joined together. One of the most beautiful sounds to the human ear is the lonesome wail of a whistle echoing through the night. It is nostalgic music to those who lived through the age of the steam locomotive. I can recall seeing them rumbling through the night with sparks blowing from the smokestack, and the cherry red glow of the firebox, as the firemen shoveled more coal into the mouth of the hungry beast. During the Depression years back in the 1930s when Dad would stop at a railroad crossing, I liked to watch the hoboes setting or standing in the open doors of the boxcars, and I always wondered who they were and where they were going. Many were roaming the country in search of work. Being with little or no funds, that was their principal means of transportation. There were 3 classes of people who rode the rails: hobos, tramps, and bums. Hobos would usually work or offer to work for their meals. Tramps usually walked the roads most of the time rather than riding the trains, and they seldom worked. They got most of their meals by begging. I can recall hobos coming to our house in search of a meal. My mother never turned any away. They would dine on the back porch stairs. The back door was the only door that we used. The front door was actually a side door that entered into our living room that also served as a dining room, for company only, and as a bedroom, divan with a hideaway bed. The front door was never used. It was opened in the hot summer months but only to let in a dab of air. Air conditioners were unheard of back then. We finally came into possession of a little fan that had elastic ribbons for blades. It didn't put out much air, but every little bit helped, but only if you were fortunate enough to be the one in front of it. The only hobo that I ever knew personally was my first cousin Leo Slater. But we didn't consider him a genuine hobo. Leo lived on a farm with his folks, on the Kickapoo Indian Reservation near Horton, Kansas. Occasionally he would hop a freight train and visit his aunts, uncles, and cousins. Like many others, that was his only means of transportation. He would hop one at Horton and get off at St. Joe, and walk a 1/4 of a mile to our house. I was always in awe of him, knowing that he actually hopped freight trains and traveled to faraway places, even as far away as Omaha, Nebraska. He and his cousin on his mother's side of the family, Ivan Weinel, rode a freight train to Denver, Colorado. It was cold, so they got in a car load of sheep to keep warm. While he was there, he met a girl and fell in love with her. He and Juanita Del Springston were married at Denver on New Year's Day of 1939. In 1937, Uncle Earl Russell bought a new Chevrolet and we became the proud owners of his 1931 Oldsmobile. I don't know how much Dad had to give for it, but it was probably pretty reasonable. We were in hog heaven when Dad drove it up through EARL and parked it in the driveway. The following spring Dad built a trailer. He used the bed and running gear of an old Model T Ford pickup truck. Then he built a trailer hitch onto the rear bumper. Dad was on a roll. He put upright stakes in all 4 corners and stretched a white canvas over the stakes and battened it down tight. The following day during the early morning hours, we loaded our blankets into the trailer and Mom loaded up some food for us to eat along the way. Jerry was 8 months old and Suzanne was not quite 2. Mom laid them on the back seat, and Bob, Bud and I crawled into the trailer. Much to our parents' chagrin and to our delight, we were experiencing a good old-fashioned spring thunderstorm at the hour of our departure, so we just snuggled down in our big heavy comforter and listened to the rain pitter-pattering down on the canvas top. This was my first trip, and one that I have remembered all these years. We were headed for Fort Madison, Iowa to visit Aunt Susie and Uncle Doyle. It was 468 miles round trip. Considering the cars and roads back then, this was a major trip. After traveling for a while, daylight came and the sun came brightly shining through, so we opened the back up and were able to see out. My big brothers would stick their hands out the back and around the corner, trying to guess how fast we were going. One would say, "I think we are going 40, and the other would stick his hand out and say, "Nope, I'll bet we are doing at least 50. And so on. In reality, I would guess that 40 was about maximum cruising speed. I don't recall how many hours it took to make the trip, but I think it was most of the day. I don't recall what we did while there, or how long we stayed, but I sure do remember the traveling part. That was the only trip that I ever took with Mom and Dad and the family, but it left me with fond memories that have lasted throughout all these many years. Like most boys and men, automobiles have been an important thing in my life. We never seem to outgrow our fascination for them. You may have noticed that I reference periods of my life by the year and make of cars that we had. There are many stories involving cars that I can recall in my younger days. Like the one back in 1938. Our neighbor Height Smith had a 1931 7-passenger Buick. It had folding jump seats in the back, in front of the rear seat. I think it may have been a former funeral home family car. It was a huge old car with high spoke wheels and front fender wells where the spare tires were carried. It had a long engine compartment that housed the big straight 8 engine. The hood seemed like it was 8 feet long from the windshield out to the big square radiator. It had an open luggage carrier on the back that you could strap things onto. It also had high running boards that enabled you to climb up into the huge chariot. I remember the time that Hyde and Hazel went somewhere with friends, and left Thiel 13-year-old son, Sam, unattended. He could always think of lots of ways to get into mischief. On this occasion he decided to treat the neighborhood kids to an unauthorized tour of EARL in the big Buick. Down through the years I have always thought how great it would have been to have had a movie of us climbing up and into that big old car as we took our seats. I was relegated to the rear of the car and occupied one of the jump seats. Then Sam took his place behind the huge wooden steering wheel. I don't recall who all went, but we had a full load. Sam pushed the stator and the monstrous engine came to life with a deep rumble. He managed to back it out of the driveway and onto the road without hitting anything. He headed up the hill and we were on our way. This was years before automatic transmissions. We actually toured EARLJARRETT and returned without a mishap. I don't think Hyde ever heard about our trip. If he did, we didn't hear about it. Sam was an only child and his folks doted on him, and he got away with things that our dad would never have tolerated. It was at about this time that Hyde bought Sam a little square cracker box miniature car called an Austin. The engine never did run, but we still had a lot of fun with it. We would push it up the hill as far as we could, then we would pile onto the fenders and running boards and bumpers, and away we would go down the hill. We would get up a good head of steam. Fortunately, we never had any crashes. I don't know what finally happened to it. It most likely ended up in the junkyard. There were many things that I was allowed to be privy to through the generosity of my big brothers. I trailed along behind them at every opportunity. They were probably afraid not to let me hang around for fear that I might snitch on them. I sure liked riding in Sam's model, a Ford convertible coupe his dad had bought him. He enjoyed driving around the South EARLJARRETT Loop. It had a couple of good hills and he would really make the dust fly. In the 30s I was crazy about airplanes and wanted to be a pilot when I grew up. The folks used to take us over to Rosecrans Field to see the airplanes up close. That may seem unusual in today's world, but back then when the old bi-wing mail plane came over, we would stop what we were doing and watch it until it was out of sight. Even today when an airplane passes overhead I usually stop and watch it, especially if it's a prop-driven plane. Back then Dad would drive up to the north end and head west on Chestnut Street, going up and over the river bluff and down to the Missouri River bottom. Near the bottom of the hill we passed by a grocery store. Mom and Dad's friends, Hugh and Gertrude Ryan, lived at 417 Chestnut. Back then you didn't have to cross the river to get to the airport. A few years later the old mighty Missouri River cut it off from the Missouri side. At the time there was a grass runway and one hangar. Little did I realize that I would make my first solo flight from this airport many years later. I recall seeing a yellow airplane that had a tricycle landing gear with twin tail booms and twin rudders. These things were unheard of back then. It was powered by a Ford V8 automobile engine. The aircraft was custom built in St. Joseph by Hayden Campbell. He later went to work for Lockheed Aircraft. Lockheed went on to produce an airplane with twin rudders, the Lockheed Electra. Amelia Earhart was flying one when she vanished at sea on July 18, 1937. I remember all of the talk and excitement at the time of her tragedy. It is not known if Mr. Campbell played a part in the design or production of the Electra. I also recall as a little boy all of the talk about the Hindenburg dirigible crash on May 6, 1937. Some of the things that I remember about our little EARLJARRETT home were the linoleums that served as our rugs. Also the fold-down tables that Dad made to conserve space in the crowded little kitchen. And how could I forget the old cook stove that used white gasoline? Sometimes it would malfunction and fire would flame up. Dad would pick it up and run it out into the backyard. It's a wonder we hadn't burned the house down. Eventually he bought a new electric range for Mom, and boy was she ever proud of it. I remember it like it was yesterday. It seemed like we spent a good part of our lives in our fruit/storm cellar. Mom was always quick to grab the coal oil lamp and herd us kids into the cellar. Dad would usually complain about running to the cellar every time a cloud blew up, but that didn't deter Mom one bit. I still have that old coal oil lamp. It's probably 75 or 100 years old. I didn't mind our storm runs, and being a kid I actually found them exciting. In 1938, something came into the neighborhood that became a focal point during our growing up years. Bill Wallace and his wife Maggie built a grocery store with their living quarters in the rear portion. It was located at 929 East Lake Boulevard. Mr. Wallace had been manager of the home oil service station at 1108 Roosevelt Avenue prior to opening the store. The EARLJARRETT kids would make many a trip down the hill to that little store, selling pop bottles and milk bottles to buy candy and soda pop. The cigarettes were for our dads. Honest, cross my heart. A sack of Bull Durham Roll Your Own was 5p, and a package of Marlboro cigarettes was 11. The dirty little secret that Mr. and Mrs. Wallace didn't know. Dad smoked Camels. I would continue to smoke until I was 25 years old. This past Christmas marks my 46th smoke-free year. Another entertainment that we enjoyed in the 30s was what Dad called hustling. We did this by driving up South 6th Street on Saturday night and parking near the B&M Tavern and other establishments along there. Something interesting was always happening on Saturday night, and like most of our entertainment didn't cost anything. We did quite a bit of it. It was basically people watching. Can you imagine kids of today sitting in a car and watching people and calling it entertainment? I still enjoy sitting in the car or on a bench watching them pass by. I recall one evening back in the 30s when Dad had to go uptown and I rode along. As he was heading down 5th Street in the 31 Olds, nearly all of the houses that we passed for about 2 blocks had a woman sitting at the front window waving at us, and each had a little red light on. I thought that Dad must really be important to have so many people smiling and waving at us. Recently, for no apparent reason, a number popped into my head. It was 80,680. For a brief moment I was puzzled, but then it dawned on me, that was our old phone number down in EARL, and I hadn't thought of it for 50 years, or more. Why it popped up out of the blue I'll never know. I remember the day that we got our first phone. Blue and Guy already had one. When we got ours, Nick and Louie headed up to their place and I went in and dialed their number. It was almost like old Tom Edison on his first phone. We just couldn't get enough of it. We would call about every half hour. We also soon became quite popular with several of the neighbors who were without phones. Some became regular users of our service. The Jarrett kids were just about to bust their buttons because they had something that the neighbors were clamoring to use. I don't think Mom was getting the kick out of it that we were, at least she didn't seem as thrilled about having all of the company, but she was always gracious to everyone. Today nearly everyone in America has at least one phone, and most have several, including cellular phones that they carry with them everywhere they go. They can call anywhere in the world on it. But back in the 30s, only a handful of people in EARL had a telephone. I think the reason that we got one was because Dad had been promoted and was probably told that he should get on so he could be reached, was probably told that he should get on so he could be reached, was probably told that he should get on so he could be reached, was probably told that he should get on so he could be reached, was probably told that he should get on so he could be reached, was probably told that he should get on so he could be reached, was probably told that he should get on so he could be reached, was probably told that he should get on so he could be reached, was probably told that he should get on so he could be reached, was probably told